On July 20, 1973, the world lost Bruce Lee. He was only 32 years old, at the height of his glory, a man who seemed indestructible. But his sudden collapse in Hong Kong actress Ting Pei's apartment changed everything. Overnight, she went from rising star to the most hated woman in Asia, accused of a legend's death. For half a century, she remained silent, locked in the shadow of suspicion. Today, at 78 years old, she has finally spoken. And what she revealed about that night forced the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew. Ting Pei's rise. Before her name was forever linked to a tragedy, Ting Pei had already built a successful life for herself. Born Tang Mei Li on February 19, 1947, in Taipei, Taiwan, she grew up in a wealthy and respected family. Her father was a doctor and her education was strict and traditional. Her family expected her to follow a stable and honorable career, far from the chaos of the entertainment industry. But Betty harbored other ambitions. From a very young age, she was drawn to the glamour of the screen, fascinated by the idea of becoming an actress in a changing Asia. In 1967, at only 20 years old, she signed with Shaw Brothers Studio, then Hong Kong's most powerful film company. It was the golden age of Mandarin cinema, and the studio was producing dozens of films each year. Betty quickly became known for her striking beauty and magnetism, often chosen to embody mysterious seductress roles that exploited her femme fatale image. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, her face was recognizable on film posters throughout Hong Kong, in both dramas and martial arts films. But fame came with stereotypes. Although she was ambitious and capable of a wide variety of performances, the industry often locked her into temptress or dangerous woman roles. The public began to associate her real personality with the character she portrayed. This image, whether true or not, would later haunt her in a way she never could have imagined. By the early 1970s, Betty's career was flourishing. She was under contract with Golden Harvest, Shaw Brothers' rival studio, directed by Raymond Chow. Golden Harvest had just discovered a young actor who would forever transform martial arts cinema, Bruce Lee. Through Chow, Betty's life crossed with Bruce's, and nothing would ever be the same again. At that moment, Bruce Lee wasn't yet the global icon he would become after Enter the Dragon, but in Hong Kong, he was already a superstar. His films The Big Boss and Fist of Fury had shattered box office records, and his charisma had made him a household name. When Betty was introduced to him in 1972 at a dinner with Raymond Chow and Bruce's wife Linda, she simply considered him as another colleague from the same milieu. She couldn't know that within the year that would follow, their names would be forever linked to scandal, grief, and unanswered questions. Bruce Lee at his peak and his relationship with Ting Pei. In 1972, Bruce Lee had become more than a movie star. He was a cultural phenomenon, a man who was transforming how the world perceived martial arts and redefining what Asian actors could accomplish in cinema. With The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, he had already proven his Hong Kong box office power. His own directing project, The Way of the Dragon, which presented to the public his unforgettable duel with Chuck Norris, cemented his legend. And in 1973, he was filming Enter the Dragon, his first major Hollywood-backed film, which was to propel him to global superstar status. But behind these triumphs, cracks were appearing. Bruce was pushing himself to the absolute limit. Known for his obsessive discipline, he trained relentlessly, sometimes taking only one meal per day to maintain his figure. He experimented with supplements, painkillers, and diuretics, always seeking an advantage. Those close to him noticed he was often exhausted, complaining of violent headaches and crises. In May 1973, only 2 months before his death, he collapsed while dubbing dialogue for Enter the Dragon and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors discovered cerebral edema, but Bruce dismissed the problem and insisted on continuing to work. To fans, he embodied strength, but privately, his health was more fragile than imagined. It was during this turbulent period that Bruce's relationship with Ting Pei developed. Betty later revealed that it was Bruce who had courted her. She stated frankly, "Everyone loved him. If I hadn't felt anything, that would have been strange. He saw something good in me that others didn't see." Their relationship wasn't just physical, she affirmed, but deeply emotional. For those around them, Betty became known by the nickname Little Dragon Lady, born from her constant presence alongside Bruce. She chose his clothes, accompanied him to appointments with Raymond Chow, and even took him to get his hair cut during filming. Speculation about their relationship never ceased. Some saw it as an affair, accusing Betty of breaking up a home. Others suggested their bond was more complex, less a betrayal than a search, on Bruce's part, for a place where he could let his guard down. Betty herself described him as a man crushed by unbearable pressure. Hollywood, Hong Kong, his family, his fans. With her, he could simply be Bruce and not the icon. Yet their relationship remained surrounded by secrets. Bruce remained married to Linda Lee, with whom he had 2 young children, Brandon and Shannon. Betty was often accused of hiding in the shadow of another woman's marriage. But she later insisted that she never wanted to replace Linda or destroy their family. She had simply responded to Bruce's pursuit, trapped in a relationship that was never meant to be public. In 1973, Bruce was busier than ever. He was revising scripts, preparing Game of Death and promoting Enter the Dragon. The demands were endless and the headaches returned with increasing frequency. Betty remembered that he sometimes trembled, pacing nervously in the room, muttering about stress and fear. She never pressed him to explain, a regret that would haunt her for decades. In July, Bruce appeared emaciated and worn, the shadow of the man who had once embodied invincibility. The last day, July 20th, 1973. July 20th, 1973 began like any other day for Bruce Lee, but by nightfall, the world would be forever changed. He was only 32 years old and preparing for a future that seemed limitless. That morning, he spent time reviewing plans for his next major project, Game of Death. He had already choreographed fight scenes and discussed with Raymond Chow, the boss of Golden Harvest, the casting of international stars like George Lazenby. The meeting planned that very evening in Betty Ting Pei's apartment was supposed to be just one more step toward realizing his vision. Around 5 p.m., Bruce arrived at Betty's in the Kowloon Tong district of Hong Kong. Raymond Chow accompanied him, but left later to attend to other business and meet Lazenby. Betty remembered that Bruce appeared unwell from the start. He seemed tired, agitated, and different. Around 7 p.m., he began complaining of a violent headache. Betty offered him an equagesic tablet, a common painkiller in Hong Kong that combined aspirin and a muscle relaxant. Bruce had already taken it without problem. He swallowed the pill and went to lie down in her bedroom to rest before the dinner planned later in the evening. At first, Betty didn't pay much attention. Bruce had fainted before, notably in May, 2 months earlier, when he had collapsed due to cerebral edema. That day, doctors had managed to stabilize him and Bruce had minimized the severity. But this time was different. Around 8:30 p.m., Betty felt something was wrong. She tried to wake him, but he didn't respond. Panic seized her and she called Raymond Chow. Chow arrived around 9:45 p.m. and found Bruce still unconscious. Together, they tried to revive him, but without success. Chow contacted Betty's personal doctor, who arrived around 10 p.m. The doctor tried resuscitation and other methods, but Bruce's condition didn't improve. Finally, an ambulance was called. When he was taken to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, it was already too late. At 11 p.m., Bruce Lee was declared dead on arrival. The official report indicated that the cause of death was cerebral edema, the same condition that had already struck him months earlier. The explanation given was that he had suffered an allergic reaction to the equagesic tablet. But as soon as the news was announced, questions flew. How could a man in perfect physical condition die from a simple painkiller? Why had it taken so long before calling an ambulance? And why was he in Betty Ting Pei's apartment rather than at his home with his wife? In the hours following his death, the narrative began to change. Raymond Chow first told the press that Bruce had collapsed at home, alongside his wife Linda. Betty was erased from the story. It was only later that police reports confirmed the truth. Bruce Lee had died in Betty Ting Pei's bed. For Betty, the nightmare began immediately. At only 26 years old, she found herself at the heart of the biggest scandal in Asian cinema history. The man adored by millions had died in her apartment and the world was ready to place the blame on her shoulders. The cover-up, public fury, and conspiracy theories. The hours and days following Bruce Lee's death were chaotic. The public had lost a hero, but it was also looking for someone to blame. When the truth broke out, revealing that Bruce had died in Betty Ting Pei's apartment, the young actress instantly became the target of a storm she never could have prepared for. At first, under Raymond Chow's instruction and, it seems, at Bruce's family's request, Betty denied everything. She told the media that Bruce hadn't collapsed in her apartment, that the ambulance hadn't come from her place, and that she had no romantic connection with him. Chow insisted this was necessary to protect Bruce's image, spare his wife Linda and their 2 children, and prevent scandal from destroying Golden Harvest's commercial empire. Betty, only 26 years old and overwhelmed, felt she had no choice but to obey. But the truth always finds a way. When police reports confirmed that Bruce was indeed in her apartment, the press unleashed with ruthless fury. Betty was labeled as a temptress, a mistress, even a murderess. Some accused her of poisoning Bruce. Others claimed she had administered an aphrodisiac to him, known as Spanish fly. The tabloids went wild with headlines suggesting she had lured him into a fatal trap. In one night, Betty Ting Pei went from movie star to public enemy. Theories multiplied. Some pointed fingers at the triads, Hong Kong's infamous criminal syndicates, claiming Bruce had made enemies by refusing to cooperate with them. Others thought he had been assassinated by jealous martial artists or powerful figures fearing his growing influence. A more mystical theory claimed the Lee family was cursed, a superstition reinforced 2 decades later when Bruce's son Brandon was killed in a tragic accident on the set of The Crow in 1993. In reality, the explanations were far less sensational. Bruce had a history of fainting and signs of serious health problems in the months preceding his death. Yet because he projected an image of invincibility, few people around him dared confront him about his deteriorating condition. Betty later recalled how people were simply afraid to tell him he needed medical help, fearing his anger or refusal. He was a man accustomed to maintaining control, someone who always made his own decisions. However, the damage to Betty's reputation was irreversible. Journalists camped outside her home. Paparazzi pursued her in the streets. Fans spat on her and insulted her. She received death threats, and some producers now refused to work with her, fearing the scandal. She became a prisoner of her own home, cut off from the world. The roles she once played on screen, seductive and dangerous women, suddenly became the persona the world believed was real. Betty Ting Pei's life after the tragedy. Silence, trauma, and Buddhism. In the aftermath of July 20, 1973, Betty Ting Pei's world collapsed along with Bruce Lee's. She had been a rising actress with a promising career, but after that night, she was never again simply Betty. She became the woman in whose bed Bruce Lee died. The weight of that label was crushing. For months, she could barely go out. Journalists camped outside her house, neighbors whispered behind her back, and angry fans insulted her in the street. She later admitted having to flee her own home in the middle of the night simply to escape the crowd of journalists encircling her. At only 26 years old, Betty had become a prisoner of public hatred. The psychological shock was devastating. She received countless death threats, and the constant pressure pushed her to the brink. She later revealed having developed schizophrenia, haunted by paranoia and fear that someone would try to harm her. At her lowest point, she confessed that life seemed worse than death to her. But she refused to give in to despair. "Everyone wanted my death," she recalled. "But I told myself, why should I die? If I died, people would think I was guilty, that I had committed suicide out of shame. But I did nothing wrong. I had to keep living." In 1976, she married Charles Hung, a Hong Kong actor and entertainment magnate whose family had solid ties to the milieu. From this marriage was born a daughter, Candy, but the union didn't last. In 1980, the couple divorced. Despite their separation, Candy remained close to her mother, and Betty later described her daughter as the greatest source of comfort and warmth in her life. After the scandal, Betty's acting career almost completely faded. Producers avoided her, fearing being associated with the controversy. Roles that once came easily disappeared, and her reputation never recovered. She withdrew from public life, appearing only rarely in films or events. For decades, she avoided interviews, refusing to confirm or deny the rumors that had consumed her life. To the public, her silence seemed suspicious. For Betty, it was the only way to survive. It was during this painful period that Betty found a new path in Buddhism. She always denied becoming Buddhist because of Bruce Lee. She explained that the turning point came after her daughter's birth. Reading Buddhist scriptures, she found comfort and enlightenment. She adopted a vegetarian lifestyle and devoted herself to spiritual practice. "Today, I'm on a vast smooth road," she explained. "Whatever happens, I'm no longer afraid. I can help others thanks to the Buddhist knowledge I've acquired." For Betty, Buddhism was a way to cope with guilt, trauma, and loneliness. She admitted that even decades later, she still checked at night if her daughter was breathing, a persistent scar from the trauma of having seen Bruce Lee die in her bed. Yet she affirmed that Bruce's death had taught her to appreciate peace and simplicity. In later interviews, she stated that Bruce had been lucky to die in his sleep, calling it the most peaceful way to leave. In the 2000s, Betty Ting Pei was largely invisible to the public. She appeared only rarely outside Buddhist charitable events and lived discreetly in Hong Kong with Candy. But the questions never ceased. Rumors pursued her wherever she went. And for decades, she refused to answer them until finally, more than 50 years later, she decided to break her silence. The confession after 52 years, the shocking truth and new perspectives. For half a century, Betty Ting Pei lived under a cloud of suspicion. She was accused, mocked, and vilified, without ever giving the world a complete account of what had happened the night Bruce Lee died. Then, more than 50 years later, she finally spoke up to tell her version of the story. During a rare appearance on TVB's show The Telling Truth, Betty spoke openly about her relationship with Bruce and the events of July 20, 1973. For the first time, she confirmed what many had long suspected: that she and Bruce were lovers. "He was incredibly charming," she admitted. "The whole world loved him. Wouldn't it be strange if I didn't? He loved me and thought we were meant to be together." She explained that it was Bruce who had courted her, not the other way around, and that their relationship was based on mutual respect and genuine emotional connection. Betty also described the hours preceding his death. She remembered that Bruce arrived at her place around 5 p.m. and already appeared ill. Around 7 p.m., he complained of a headache, took an Equagesic tablet she gave him and went to rest in her bedroom. When he didn't wake up, she called Raymond Chow, who asked her to wait for his arrival before calling for help. She admitted having panicked, not knowing what to do, but pointed out that Bruce had taken the same medication many times before without problem. "Honestly, even if the medication was the cause, what could I have done? I didn't invent this product," she said. Perhaps most shocking was her admission concerning the cover-up. She confirmed that Chow had asked her to deny that Bruce died at her place, insisting it was what Bruce's family wanted. "What was I supposed to do? Go against them?" she asked. "I respected their wish." For decades, she carried the burden of that lie, vilified by the public for hiding the truth while she was protecting others. Medical experts interviewed on the show re-examined Bruce's death with modern knowledge. Some recalled that Bruce had already fainted and presented symptoms compatible with epilepsy. Others affirmed that his cerebral edema could have been a rare condition unrelated to medication. One theory even suggested a genetic role, since Bruce's father and brother had also died suddenly while resting. These perspectives painted another picture. Bruce Lee could have suffered from an undiagnosed chronic illness, aggravated by exhaustion and the pressure he imposed on himself. For Betty, speaking at 78 was less about defense than the need to turn the page. She admitted having lived with this trauma every day, checking at night if her daughter was still breathing, haunted by the memory of Bruce's final hours. "It wasn't my will. It wasn't his will. It was heaven's will," she declared. Her confession divided public opinion. Some felt sympathy, recognizing her decades of silent suffering and admitting she was also a victim of that night. Others remained skeptical, accusing her of seeking attention after so many years. But whatever the reaction, her words forced the world to reconsider the story it had been told for more than half a century. Bruce Lee's death remains one of cinema's great tragedies. A young man at his peak left too soon. But Betty Ting Pei's confession revealed something deeper. Behind the legend was a man subjected to immense pressure, and behind the scandal, a woman carrying a secret no one wanted to hear. For 52 years, Betty Ting Pei lived in silence. Today, her voice has reopened one of Hong Kong and Hollywood's greatest mysteries. Do you believe her confession finally reveals the truth about Bruce Lee's death? Or do you think the mystery remains unsolved? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the hidden side of history.